Okay, so go back to your sheet that I handed out this morning. And we're going to look at the third step of context, okay? How does the context inform the meaning of your text? And some of you are already doing that. In fact, this is where you see the benefit of a lot of your studies, how they influence your understanding of the text. And so I'm just going to point out a couple of things. So first of all, you want to pay attention, obviously, to what comes before your text and what comes after your text. That's the literary context. So I put an asterisk right here by number 7, okay? Because what happens here in chapter 16, verses 14 through 23, I mean, in order to really understand that, I mean, it's so fascinating to see what has gone on before and what goes on after that. So, as we are watching the rise of David, we are watching Saul completely fall apart. And the Spirit of God, through the author of 1 Samuel, is giving us a close-up view of Saul, who is losing his mind. This guy what's happening to him, psychologists would say it is psychosis. He is just completely unraveling. And it's incredible to see. So you're dealing with a text where later on, the king of the people of God is ordering the death of the priests of God. How does he get to that point? And so, in order to really appreciate, all right, what's happening to Saul, then all we have to do is then go back to chapter 13, and we're realizing the influence, the fear that's starting to come into Saul. All right, so this is a really fascinating theme that's woven in throughout this book. So I'm convinced that 1st and 2nd Samuel are trying to answer the question, who should be king? And initially, the children of Israel, they come to Samuel and they demand a king. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses already made provision for a king. We also know, based upon Hannah's song, that there's going to be a king. We also know, based upon Jacob's prophecy at the end of Genesis, I think it's Genesis 49 and verse 10, that the scepter is going to come from Judah. So God has already made it clear he's gonna have a king. So when Saul comes on the scene, initially we think, this is the king. But it doesn't take very long for us to realize, Saul is a king after man's heart. Saul looks like the kings of this world. He looks like the presidents and the prime ministers of this world. And what happens, and here is an amazing thing. When somebody gets into power, they are given power in order to protect and care for the people who are under them. But power does a strange thing. It grips the person who has it. And instead of using that power to protect the people, over time, you see it in political positions, you see it in police officers, you see it in the military, and this is universal. The same power that person is supposed to have to protect the people, they end up using to attack the people. Now, what people do, because they are so fearful of their security, they give power away. They give power to people in charge to protect them. But when you give that power away, then who is going to protect you when that person uses that power to attack you? And that's what's so frightening as we're watching this take place in 1 Samuel. So David becomes this wonderful military figure who is able to fight the battles against the Philistines. He is able to protect the people. And what does Saul do? He tries to kill David. So, just watching the literary context, just watching what happens before, what happens after, you begin to see all these dynamics. So, Saul's biggest friend, Saul's greatest ally, Saul's greatest strength really is David. But Saul views him as his greatest enemy. David is not Saul's enemy. Saul is Saul's enemy. And so Saul tries to start attacking David. Now, Samuel tells Saul that the Lord has rejected you from being king. And then Samuel tells Saul, the Lord has found someone. And from that point on, Saul, he's looking to find out who that person is, and he wants to kill him. He wants to eliminate that threat. But what does God do? He puts he organizes it so that the threat to Saul's kingdom, the next king, is right there in Saul's presence, playing his harp. Okay? And then what does he do? He marries his daughter. And Saul ends up bringing David right into his family. And Jonathan becomes best friends with David. And it's fascinating to see all of this, all these themes working together. Now, so far, all you have done is you've read the text. You don't have to go to any commentary yet. All right? And I am not opposed to commentaries. I use commentaries. I just don't use them that much. Because you let the Word speak, and you get You know what that word is saying. You see those themes that are coming. And so commentaries can be helpful for filling in some of the holes or helping you. Like you might be not sure if it's plot development or if it's reversal. Or you might be wondering if it's reversal or if it's contrast. That's fine. You might even change your mind. And in fact, you might have a commentary that helps bring something out. They go, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. All of that is so good. But you will eventually get to the big idea. But understanding what takes place in your text before it happens and what takes place after your text is so very important. Now, I'm going to be preaching a lot in this preaching conference. And I'm going to preach 5 sermons from chapter 17. That's why we've not covered chapter 17. All right? Everyone's wondering, man, where's David and Goliath? So I'm going to do David and Goliath, okay? But you're going to hear those sermons now with so much more interest and understanding because of all this work that you're doing, okay? And that's simply because there's the literary context. Now, the second thing is the historical context, okay? Now, we don't know exactly who the author is. But I mean, I think you're already seeing it. Whoever wrote this was a fabulous writer. They knew how to tell a story. And the Lord really handpicked somebody with that. Well, we know who the audience is. This is the people of Israel. Now, some think that this was written in order to help the Jews following the exile, really understand their history. I think it was written earlier than that. I think it was written not long after the reign of David in order to establish these things. But it's really helpful if you know what are, the circumstances, how the people would have, what life was like for them. So those are questions that you want to be thinking about as you look at your text. What was happening politically? What was happening economically? What was happening environmentally? So, for example, the Philistines, up until this point, they ruled everything. If you are the audience, most of you are working in the farms, and you know that every year when it comes to the harvest time, the Philistines are coming in and they're taking the harvest. And it is so hard, it is so angry, it is so sad. Biblical context. What are the biblical citations? What are the allusions? What are the historical connections to other texts that are in the text? So, for example, in the account of David and Jonathan says to David basically, I know you're going to be the king, and I know that, and I'm going to, if I have to, I will die for you. Anytime somebody says in the Bible, I'm willing to die for you, well, our ears perk up, don't they? Because we know ultimately who died for us. And so you have Jonathan, who's the son of a king, who himself is royalty, who's willing to lay aside his royalty in order to die for his friend. That's a beautiful picture there, isn't it? Even though we know David is many times, because of the Davidic covenant and because of Matthew's gospel and how it begins with the genealogy of David coming to Christ, we know that David, is a picture of Christ in many ways. But here in that text, it's Jonathan who's such a beautiful picture of that. So that would be an example of a biblical connection that's there. All right, so if you go back to chapter number 1, all right? When I preached this text, because it was at the beginning of a brand new book, I drew upon the literary context, I drew upon the historical context, I drew upon the biblical context, and I drew upon the cultural context. And here's my introduction. This story begins where the book of Ruth leaves off. And the book of Ruth occurred during the days of the judges, which were exceedingly dark and morally repulsive. It has been 400 years since the death of Moses and the conquest of the land of Canaan. But instead of living under God's law, the history of God's people is one of continual rebellion and its resulting chaos. It is stunning and disgusting to read what occurred in the lives of the people of Israel in those days. But in those days, there was no king. There's no king in Israel. And everybody did that which was right in their own eyes. That was true of the people, and it was true of the priests, as we will see. How could anyone be expected to follow the Lord in the midst of this, when the entire cultural landscape was tilted towards so much godlessness? And even some of those who participated in the ceremonies of the Old Testament law, they so mixed and mingled this with other pagan practices and immorality that it didn't even look recognizable that it was from the Lord. So on the whole, the people of God didn't look anything like the people of God. The last judge in the book of Judges was Samson. His enemy and the enemy of Israel was the Philistines. And that was still the case. Israel was threatened from without, and she was corrupt from within. How is this problem going to be fixed? The judges had tried. Most of them were flawed, some rather deeply. And even the good ones died and didn't have a very good transition plan. The judges were not good enough to rescue Israel. Israel had a problem she could not solve. The tribes became even more tribalistic. Any unity was based upon a mutual enemy of the moment. And because Israel rejected the law of God, the tabernacle at Shiloh did not appear to hold them together. Israel rejected the God she could not see, and she wanted a leader she could see. When asked, "Who is your king?" the answer should have been, "Yahweh is." But Israel seemed embarrassed by that. Her God sat on a throne as a cloud in a little room in a little tent. What kind of a king is that? She wanted a king that she could see, talk to, follow into battle. How is that going to happen? And could Israel follow God and at the same time have a king that she could see and talk to and follow into battle and who would defend her from her enemies? Well, we don't know. But the end of the book of Ruth appears to give us a clue. When the final verse of the book of Ruth says, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered who? David. God had a solution that was bigger than anyone could imagine, even bigger than David. So therefore, the theme of 1st and 2nd Samuel is, who should be the king? But there's another theme. It's a little more subtle, but it's also related to who should be the king. And this theme is, the Lord looks on the heart. So, the answer to the question of who should be the king is somehow going to be answered by someone who has the kind of heart that completely follows God. And that question is not fully answered until the book of Matthew. So for now, our eyes are focused on a homestead in the hill country of Ephraim, and here we are introduced to 3 different people. So, in that introduction, you heard literary context, you heard biblical context, you heard cultural context, you heard historical context, and I was tying not only the book of Judges, actually I was tying the Pentateuch to Joshua, to Judges, to Ruth, to 1st and 2nd Samuel, all the way to Matthew, and if I had a little bit more time, I could tie it all the way to Revelation. So when you do that, when you teach that way, when you preach that way, you help your people read their Bibles better, because they see how this text connects to all of the texts, because they all connect so well together. So when you're then teaching from Psalms, like Psalm 2, okay, and the King's Psalm, or Psalm 1, which is what kind of what kind of a heart does God look for? All those things just start, they all connect so well together. All right, so it's getting really, really hot, and you are really, really tired, okay? And you have done a really, really good job. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and take a break right here, because I think anything else that I say is not going to be remembered, all right? Because it's very hot. We will meet in air conditioning this afternoon, okay? On the 2nd floor, and Jerry will be teaching Psalms there. What I would like you to do, okay, between now and tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, okay, we will meet back in here, and I want us to look at each of our passages again, and we're going to try to come up with what is the author's main idea, okay? So if you can be thinking about that between now and then, that's what we'll begin with, and then we will build from there, okay? But you've done a commendable job today, and I look at your thinking on all of these things, and I think in many cases you got it. In a couple of cases, I think you're close. I don't think that's the exact one, But keep in mind, you had a half hour, right? That's all you had. And you've done such a good job in a half hour, all right? So when you have a lot more time to read and read and read and read and study, and again, this is new to you, but as you keep doing this, you become so much sharper with it, and this becomes so helpful to you. So I just want you to know I am very, very encouraged with your work on this and how you're digging into the text and seeing what's there. Because when you discover the author's main point, and then that becomes the dominant theme of your lesson or your sermon, then everything you say in that lesson or sermon, you want it to serve that main point. That's what you're trying to get across to your audience. And that protects you from saying things that the text is not saying, because now you know what it is saying. So what we're working on right now, if you go back to my first talk about staying on the line, okay, we are working on what is in that line so we stay on that line. All right.